I'm Christine Hurley with the Institute of Politics, and I'm pleased to welcome to campus Essie Cupp and Van Jones. As many of you know, the IOP hosts an ongoing series of discussions that seek to elevate and expand the public conversation and cultivate the next generation of leaders. This program is no different, and it's a continuation of our America in the Trump Era series. The goal of these discussions is to look at the cultural, policy, and media changes coming under the Trump administration. Monday, we're convening a discussion on the future of the Democratic Party. Mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg, Mayor of Atlanta, Kasim Reed, former Undersecretary of the Army, Patrick Murphy, and the former spokesperson for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, Simone Sanders, will all be here to explore that issue. You can find out more about this event and all of our upcoming events on our website, politics.uchicago.edu. During our conversation, we'll open up the floor to take questions from the audience. You can ask your question by coming to the microphone that will be placed in the center aisle. As always, we give priority to students to ask the first 3 questions. I also want to thank International House for their partnership on this event and their continued support of the IOP. Now is a good time to make sure your phones are on silent. And now here to formally introduce our guest is Dylan Wells. Dylan is a second year in the college, majoring in political science. She is the elections editor for The Gate and is the events intern for the IOP. Please join me in welcoming Dylan to the podium.
In a time of contention between President Trump and the press, the media serves an increasingly prominent role in understanding current events and political happenings in the United States. 2 of the most valuable voices in this discussion are Essie Cupp and Van Jones, who join us today for a conversation about politics in the Trump era. Essie Cupp is a conservative political commentator for CNN. She previously appeared on Crossfire, MSNBC's The Cycle, and The Blaze's Real News. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Politico, New York Daily News, The Washington Post, and countless other publications. And she has authored 2 books titled Losing Our Religion and Why You're Wrong About the Right. She is also a former Jeopardy winner and served as a consultant for one of my favorite TV shows, The Newsroom. She is a member of the advisory board of the Georgetown Institute of Politics, and yesterday was her birthday. Van Jones is a liberal commentator for CNN and the founder of several nonprofits, including Rebuild the Dream Corps, Color of Change, and the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. He's the author of 2 books, The Green Collar Economy and Rebuild the Dream. He served as former President Obama's special advisor for green jobs, and in 2009, he was named one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world. This past year, the New York Times called Mr. Jones a star of the 2016 campaign due to his viral comments about President Trump on CNN, including his election night declaration that the results signaled a white lash against President Obama in a changing electorate. Leading today's discussion is IOP Director and fellow CNN commentator, Mr. David Axelrod. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
What a wonderful, wonderful group on a Friday afternoon. And what a wonderful group up here. I'm pleased to be among 2 good friends. We spent a lot of time together over the last couple of years. And I want to get into what happened over the last couple of years and where we're going. But I think a good place to start is to ask each of you a similar question. You, Van, are have become an iconic progressive voice in our country. Essie, you're a prominent conservative in this country. I know you're close friends. Why are you a conservative, and how would you define your conservatism?
Yeah. So just by way of brief background, I didn't grow up in a very political household. I assumed, because I watched movies, that conservatives were evil and liberals were all good people, so therefore I was liberal, for sure. I got to college and realized I disagreed with a lot of people around me just on basic things on politics, and realized maybe I wasn't a liberal. And so I investigated some of conservatism in an academic sense, reading Hayek and Tocqueville, stuff like that, and thought, academically, this sounds like me. I became an actual conservative when I started paying taxes. When I got a job, and I understood the way, all of this really affected me personally, not just in books. I didn't become a conservative because someone told me liberals were awful or terrible. This wasn't a reaction to people. It was a very optimistic time for conservatism when I got sort of like ensnarled in it. It was empowering. I liked the idea of self-reliance. I liked the idea of a limited government. Those are all things that appealed to me. The social stuff, too, but really it was oriented around issues of fiscal responsibility. And then when 9/11 happened in my backyard, it was around some defense and foreign policy issues. And today, I haven't changed. Some other people in my party have. No. I'm the same person I was 15 years ago when I discovered conservatism. Everything that I liked then, I still believe in now.
We'll follow up on that in a second, because I was watching CPAC this morning. I was wondering how that squares with your version of conservatism. But
there's a reason I'm not there today.
Van, what about your journey?
Well, probably the X-Men are the origin point for me of my politics. I mean, I was born in '68. It was the year that they killed Bobby Kennedy. They killed Dr. King.
We had a convention here that year too,
right?
Yeah, exactly, sure. Beat a bunch of kids up for one end of war. So I was kind of born into a lot of that stuff, and I've been African American almost my whole life. So
except for that one time.
Well, I was into U2 really big for like 6 months, and then anyway. It's kind of, I'm a ninth generation American. And I'm the first person in my family that was born with all my rights. And so I think for a lot of people, civil rights and that kind of stuff is maybe kind of abstract. And they also think, 1,000 years ago, geez, you guys quit talking about race, it's like 1,000 years ago. Look, my mother and father were born in segregation. My mother and father were married under segregation. My cousin Kenya was born in '65 before Johnson signed the bill, the last big civil rights bill. So I'm the first one in my family born with all my rights. So for me, it felt like I was trying to continue something that was important inside my own family. Also, I was the kind of geek and the kind of nerd that made Urkel look cool. So anti-bullying politics really came easy to me. And so at the time, the X-Men was this comic book. Now they're like a big deal. No, you had to be a true geek, a true nerd. When nerd, there was no positive upside to being a nerd. It wasn't like you're gonna be a nerd and you're gonna be like rich. You're just gonna be a nerd because you're gonna be beaten up. So I got my hands on this comic book called the X-Men. And in the X-Men, all these kind of weirdo kids that didn't really fit in anywhere all would get together and they would help each other to make the world better. And I think my whole life has been basically trying to live up to what my dad and my mom were fighting for, and the X-Men.
Which particular superpowers do you have? When Essie says she came to believe in limited government and some of the other principles that she articulated, how does that square with your view of what the role of government should be?
Look, well, first of all, I think the one thing that we've gotten away from is the nobility of both traditions. We've gotten out to this point where, if you're a liberal, part of the way you define yourself as a liberal is that you hate the conservatives. That's like the first 7 points of being a liberal. And then also vice versa. And I think people forget, the Republican Party was founded to end slavery. At its best, these are seriously noble principles. The Democratic Party at its best, sticks up for working folks. Now we're in this place where both parties kind of suck. And And they suck for similar reasons, in that I think the Republicans have gotten far from those original principles, and frankly, I think a lot of Democrats have gotten far from our original principles. And when the classic kind of Democrat is, a coastal NPR Prius person, that doesn't always square.
Prius or Priebus?
Prius.
Oh, I see.
But it doesn't always square. So, look, I think people should do as much for themselves as they can. My dad, I think, had it right. My dad said, the liberals are wrong if they think, my dad grew up poor, shotgun shack, joined the military to get out, put himself through college, married the college president's daughter, my mom, because my dad had it like that. And then he put his brother through college, put his sister through college, put me through college with my mom. So my dad was that kind of up and out of poverty, guy, hard hands, military. But my dad said, listen, the liberals have it wrong if you think you can give somebody something and stop them from being poor. I was poor. You can give somebody money and stop them from being broke, but if they're still poor in their heart, they're still poor in their skills, they're still poor in their mind, they'll be broke again tomorrow. People have to climb that ladder out of poverty on their own effort, or they'll be right back in the same spot. So the liberals are wrong on that. He says, but the conservatives get it wrong too. Those kids have a responsibility to climb that ladder, but the grown people have a responsibility to make sure every kid's got a ladder to climb. And so that's why I'm a liberal, is I don't think that poor kids should have to build their own ladder and climb it. I spent a lot of time trying to build those ladders and then yelling at the kids to climb. And in that way, I'm like my dad.
And we live in a time when that rung is higher and harder to reach because of the demands of skills and education that young people need today. Essie, Van mentions the party of Lincoln, and everybody remembers Lincoln as the great emancipator. But I always honor him for something else as well, which is in the midst of the Civil War, he laid the groundwork for the Transcontinental Railroad because he thought we needed to connect the country to grow. He created the National Science Foundation because he thought innovation was so important. And he created land-grant colleges because he thought higher education shouldn't just be the province of the poor. That would, it seems to
the rich.
Of the rich, yes, of the rich. That it seems to me, would qualify him as a liberal today. What's wrong with what was wrong with Lincoln?
Nothing. No, I think you can look back at a lot of Republicans, Lincoln included. Garfield, most people don't know.
You're a big Garfield person.
I'm a Garfield geek.
That's even more obscure than the X-Men.
You know this about me.
Yes.
If you haven't read Destiny of the Republic, it's a fascinating book about Garfield. But a very short time because he was assassinated in office. And one of the first things he did, coming a couple presidents after Lincoln, was to make sure that newly emancipated slaves got an education. That was hugely important to him. He had to work for his education. He grew up poor, and he recognized it was the only thing keeping him a slave was not having an education. So this was hugely important to him. I mean, you can look back at Republicans throughout history who have, Teddy Roosevelt, big conservation guy, responsible for our national parks system. Republicans, if you talk to some of the more cartoonish Republicans today, they recoil at the idea of conservation, and that's silly. That's not in our DNA, in our political history. But I think what Van is saying is right. We've become almost cartoons of our political ideologies, and we've become reactionaries against the other side, as opposed to the normal, decent, hardwired stuff that probably made us conservative or liberal in the first place. And there are too few people on either side of the aisle who genuinely want to sit across from their political opponent and find some common ground. Because when you cede the argument or when you admit that there is common ground, you lose. It's profitable to disagree in politics today. It is profitable to leave a problem unsolved. I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, but if you look at immigration, there's a middle ground that both parties could come to. And they won't, because you don't fundraise off of agreement and comity, and you don't get reelected off of those things. That's really sad, and that's a pox on our system and both political parties, that intransigence has become more profitable than actual problem solving.
It's interesting, solutions that are embraced by one side or the other suddenly become more or less attractive based on who's proposing them. So, when Obama embraced some of the Republican principles around health care, they became unacceptable, or immigration, or climate change.
Or, executive authority.
Right.
I didn't get amnesia, okay? I remember the way Republicans reacted to what Obama did, much of which I thought they were right to do, some of which I definitely agree there was some overreach. But I didn't forget what our positions were. It seems like a lot of people in my party have forgotten the things we said we really cared about and thought were problems the last 8 years. No longer problems, apparently. That bothers me. That hypocrisy bothers me, and it bothers me that it doesn't bother more Republicans. It seems like there is a giddiness in Washington over getting an R in the White House for the first time in 8 years, that we are going to overlook all of the things we said we hated, the things we said were really dangerous and problematic for the country, because the last guy was a D, and I mean Democrat. Forgot I'm talking to a millennial audience.
Van, I remember so many times when we sat together on the set at CNN during the primary season, and you were probably a voice more than any other than our friend Jeffrey Lord, who took Trump seriously.
Yes.
And you said throughout, there's something going on out there that we're missing. There's something going on that we're missing. What were we missing?
Pain. You got people sitting on a white hot stove for years, and of every color. And there's a bipartisan elite consensus over the past 30 years that got every major question wrong from the point of view of millions of Americans. It was elite Democrats and Republicans that said, hey, let's sign these trade deals. We'll wave at the idea we're going to retrain everybody, but we're not going to take it that seriously, and it'll all work out fine. They were wrong. They said deregulate all these banks. The most oppressed people in the country are these bankers. We got to free the bankers, because how can they still be? And so he said, well, deregulate the banks. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. They said, both political parties said build prisons from coast to coast. That'll make the black community safer. It didn't work. We got into these wars without great plans because both political parties said, this is the way we're going to go. And you do that for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. At a certain point, people who are not benefiting from these decisions get really frustrated. Also, if you import into your country third world conditions, developing world conditions, which is what we have done, you will then get third world and developing world politics. 47% of Democrats voted for a socialist a few months ago. A socialist. And we now have a right-wing authoritarian strongman in the White House. That's because of pain. And it's not just economic pain. There's also a legitimate reaction that people have when cultures change. We've got to be honest as Democrats that we're asking people to absorb an awful lot of change really quickly. And everybody is not good at that. I'm not good at that. I love this place called Oakland. It's got every color in the Skittles bag. It's 300,000 people. You've got 37 languages spoken in the public schools. I love Oakland. But guess what? Oakland is now changing because half an hour down the road is a place called Silicon Valley. And suddenly now people who are not traditional Oaklanders are coming there. They're making a lot of money. They're changing the place. And people in Oakland are reacting, saying, we like Oakland the way it is. If I could build a wall.
And make Silicon Valley pay for it.
And make Silicon Valley pay for it. Right? I would do that. Right? Because change is hard. And so there's a big demographic thing happening. In Europe, it's because of Africa and the Middle East. In the United States, it's because of Latin America. And some people aren't dealing with it well. Is it easy to take the cheap way and just call them all bigots and racists and whatever? Yeah, keep doing that. See how that's working. My point is that there's real pain out there. And I saw the political elite in both parties playing these games. It's easy for me to say the Black Lives Matter kids hate cops, when we all know that you got kids doing drugs on Ivy League campuses who never go to prison. You got kids doing drugs in housing projects 5 blocks away that go every time, and they've got a legitimate beef. But it's easy to say, oh no, they just hate cops. It's easy to say that all these white guys out here who are frustrated or just somehow all want to be in the Ku Klux Klan, when it's just not true. They've got some economic and social pain and anxiety, and if you didn't show up when their plant closed, NAACP, if you didn't show up when their plant closed, the National Organization of Women, if you didn't show up when their plant closed, Greenpeace, well then don't be mad when Donald Trump showed up. So there's something happening out here. And I don't know what the answers are, but being from a small town, I grew up on the edge of a small town in rural West Tennessee, a red state, and then got a chance to go to Yale, a fancy law school. I know elitism. I know elitism, and I know bigotry. And there's plenty of elitism in the Democratic Party, and there's some bigotry in the Republican Party, and both parties should look in the mirror. And when a Trump gets elected, both parties should be ashamed of themselves.
It seems to me, I thought when you said there was, we almost nominated a socialist, I thought you were going to say, not that that's a bad thing. But here's the thing that you talk about this rapid change.
Yes.
I think it's hard to have this discussion absent a recognition of the impact that technology is having. So we've just had this big election, a lot of which centered on trade and globalization. And now we have President Trump who's saying, I'm going to cancel the TPP, I'm going to cancel trade deals, I'm going to jawbone companies like Carrier and ask them or force them or compel them to stay in Indiana. And one of the things that struck me was a story that said, Carrier said, yes, we're going to keep our plant in Indiana, but in order to be economically feasible, we're probably going to automate a lot of it. So, Essie, I want you both to comment on this. It seems to me that a lot of this discussion about trade is yesterday's battle, and that the real threat today is less Mexico and China and more robots and computers. And what do we do about that? And what is the role that government should play in that?
Well, I'm reminded of a guy you might remember named Mitt Romney. Just wasn't his time. But that whole debate over our corporations' people really struck some people the wrong way, but I happened to understand what he meant by that. And I think when you're talking about automation and technology, you really have to understand the human behind all of that. And automation is jobs behind automation. There's new jobs. I always, when we worry sort of about what the future is going to do, to humanity, I always think of, naturally, Malthus, who worried very much that we'd run out of land and food, that the population would explode before we could come up with enough food to feed us all. What Malthus didn't anticipate was innovation in technology, was the Industrial Revolution, new ways of production and feeding people. And so I tend to err on the side of optimism, and that as humans, we will all still protect the dignity and economic importance of human work. But these are things we're going to have to reconcile, and I do worry that we don't have the president who's going to be the best at explaining this or navigating us through this. Well, he's very good on Twitter. I don't think he thinks...
So he is familiar with technology.
Yes, I think he's familiar. I mean, speaking of technology, this metaphor has been going on in my head since the election. I feel like as a Republican, with the election of Donald Trump, I feel like I was catfished, essentially. That, like, the guy I thought I was talking to, like the Republican I really kind of fell in love with, Paul Ryan, turned out to be Donald Trump, and I'm like, that's not who I thought I was talking to this entire time. That's not who I, was making kissy faces at over the phone. That's an aside. But I think we're going to need saner heads in government who understand that government is a force for good, even if you believe it should be limited, and that the human value of technology and jobs has to be sort of ushered through this new wave of technology.
Van, I raise this because you talked before about the ladder, and I said the rung is higher.
Yeah.
These jobs that Essie's talking about are highly skilled jobs.
Yeah.
They're jobs that require more and not less education and training. One of the things, for example, that we need to think about that is maybe a bit of an aside, but we have driverless cars coming online by the end of this decade, and we've got millions of people who make a living driving trucks, driving mass transit, driving cabs, driving Ubers and Lyfts and so on. It seems to me this is a big crisis that actually requires some leadership to deal with, and I didn't hear any of that discussion in the last campaign. I heard a lot of discussion about trade treaties. We should point out that Van came here ill and suited up anyway, so give him a hand for that.
When you all catch my cold, you won't be clapping.
We moved the chairs back a few inches here.
Couple things I think is important, especially for people who take the country seriously. It used to be that the future, to the extent that the future could be written, it was written in laws in Washington, D.C. by people who are elected. Today, the future is being written in code in Silicon Valley by people who you don't even know. The problem with the kinds of populisms that you're seeing, I'm a populist. There are elites out there that do bad things, and people need to rise up and keep them in check. I'm for that. But here's a problem. You have two populisms in the country, neither of which are focused on the right elite. So if you look at the Democratic Party and the progressive wing of our party, you can draw a straight line from Seattle in '99 through Occupy to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. That wing of our party is mainly focused on the financial elite on Wall Street, with some reason. If you look at the populism in the Republican Party, it tends to be focused on, at least rhetorically, the political elite in Washington, D.C., and then the Hollywood and media elite, with some justification. But if you look at the country, you have Hollywood, you have D.C., you have Wall Street, and you have Silicon Valley. And it's actually the elite in Silicon Valley that is pulling the rug out from under every industry. They're disrupting every industry on earth. They're going to wipe out about 1 billion jobs over the next 15 years. And they're creating more jobs for artificial intelligence and robots than for people. And there is no populism. In fact, we're like, listen, you can't even imagine, like, Occupy Silicon Valley. Like, you can't even, it's like, you can't even get there without using their apps. So it's not even, you aren't, like, there's no politics that even allows you to have the right conversation.
Be like 1,000 people sitting in on exercise balls trying to stop.
Yeah, it's just, and so that lets you know how far off both parties are in terms of really trying to solve real problems. And so it's part of why, I wasn't for Bernie as much as I love Bernie, and as much as frankly I thought he did a great job of raising certain issues. I wasn't for Hillary Clinton in the primaries, certainly not for Trump. I think the politics that will make a difference is yet to emerge. And so part of what I think has to happen is that those of us who are partisans have to be willing to not just accuse, but also confess. The accusations are cheap. You guys all suck. The implication meaning we're all wonderful. I think actually that's part of the problem. I think we need to have a much more confessional politics. When you have Donald Trump as president, everybody's got to be more confessional about what we don't know. But I think that the idea, I've talked to Black Lives Matter, I said, listen, be mad at racists. I am too. Be suspicious of Republicans. I am too. But you got robots that are going to do much more harm to your community, given the fact that we tend to be locked into low-skilled stuff. A lot of these technologies are Negro job-killing technologies, as best I can tell. We're the ones in the service sector. We're the ones driving these UPS things. We're on the chopping block, not for some crazy bigot who's saying mean stuff to you on Facebook. You've got a much bigger problem to solve. And by the way, you can't solve it by yourself. It might make some sense to reach out to some of the white workers and some of the Latinos and others who are also going to have the same problem and have a politics that's a little bit more expansive. This requires not reacting to everything that comes out of the White House. It requires us looking across. I know great Republicans. I'm sitting next to one of them who, you can give her a round of applause, by the way, because she's taking a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage not to jump on this Trump gravy train. It takes a lot of courage to actually to put principles over not just politics, but even over party, and say, this is what I believe. Folks like that suffer a lot in the early stages of crap like this. They tend to be vindicated over time. And I think if principled Democrats and principled Republicans can spend more time trying to solve real problems, we may find a way forward for both parties, because right now both parties still suck.
I think that this issue that we're talking about, though, is so tied up with education and training, and the lack of a national strategy to think about that seems to me to be a real deficit. And you mentioned Donald Trump. We haven't really talked about him yet. I think he would insist. So, Essie, I did watch that CPAC, the 14 minutes of Bannon in Black yesterday, and most of it was kind of a Reince and Bannon show, trying to show that they're arm in arm and marching forward together. But in between, Bannon really unfurled full Bannonism, which is this xenophobic, anti-trade, anti-immigrant, Battleship America philosophy. How do you see him in the context of conservatism? He wasn't allowed at the CPAC conference until now, which shows you what electing a president will do for you. But
so I've known Steve Bannon for quite some time. He used to make...
Did he always dress like Johnny Cash?
Yeah. I swear, when I was watching CPAC, it was like live from Folsom Prison. Like, the older folks will understand what that means. No, look, he's always cultivated this kind of persona. It wasn't so much overtly xenophobic, racist, crazy when I was, when I knew him many years ago. But it was this disruptive, I'm a disruptor, I want to deconstruct, I want to tear it all down. I think privately he'd probably consider himself a bit of an anarchist, not really even a Republican.
And it's not that private.
Yeah, maybe not. And now, whatever you think of him, he really has sort of some levers with which to make some of that happen, and that's quite scary. The Breitbart stuff, it's very unfortunate because Andrew Breitbart, who I knew very well, was a dear friend, would be appalled. Whatever you thought of what Andrew did and stood for, he would be appalled by this, I feel very comfortable saying. And so where Breitbart is now, where Steve Bannon took Breitbart, was in a absolutely indefensible place that conservatives have started totally defending. And I find that, with the Milo Yiannopoulos stuff, I find that to be so disappointing and disturbing, because there's really nothing about the quote unquote alt-right that is conservative, as I know it. And plenty of us have disavowed Milo and Breitbart, but not enough. And unfortunately, because we've got Steve Bannon in the White House, and literally, Breitbart as the presidential Pravda, it's really gotten to a position of power it has no business having. And that bothers me, that disturbs me. That's what disturbed me about Steve Bannon behind the scenes. And that he took to CPAC and sort of put it on full display was, I thought, going to really turn a lot of people off. In fact, it just really galvanized the room. And it's not the CPAC I knew. Yeah. It's not Reagan's CPAC. It's not the CPAC I used to go to. I stopped going years ago because they stopped letting gays in, and I thought that was ridiculous. But even now, to invite Milo Yiannopoulos before the pedophile stuff was indefensible. It's one thing, I'm not for censorship, it's one thing to give him a seat at Bill Maher's table. That's good, I liked that. It's one thing to invite him to a college campus, that's also good. I like that too. You are not safe from being offended just because you're in college. But I don't like the conservative imprimatur behind an asshole, pardon me, like Milo Yiannopoulos. We don't have to defend everything that purports to be conservative. We should be more discerning. And so it was good that they disinvited him, but dumb that they invited him in the first place. And conservatives have got to get a lot more discerning about the stuff that they defend if they want to reach more audiences.
Just a follow-up, because you spoke glowingly about Paul Ryan, and you have in the past. I know you're an admirer of Mike Pence. Mm-hmm. And yet these icons of the Republican Party that you identify with have been very embracing of Trump and willing to ignore a lot. Mm-hmm. You use Pravda. I assume it wasn't by accident that you chose that particular metaphor, but we saw the president who has the R next to his name, Ronald Reagan's party, equate what Vladimir Putin does with with the practices of the United States. I would think your party, if Barack Obama had said such a thing, I think your party would have been more than outraged about it. And yet,
of course,
there is mostly silence. So.
No, it's worse than that, David. It's worse than silence.
I thought I painted it pretty badly.
It's worse. It's not just silence. I have witnessed Republicans that I've known over years actively go out and defend it. Not just be silent about it, defend it, justify it, explain it. There are people who do White House briefings daily who defend and explain the last thing that the president said, even if it totally contradicts the thing he said. And that's really worrisome. I guess I can reconcile and accept the fact that Trump doesn't know, this is going to sound like like a diss, but doesn't know a lot of politics. Doesn't know a lot about the Constitution, doesn't know a lot about international law, and I'm not being elitist here.
You can't know everything.
I think he would say that's what makes him great in anti-establishment. But I've accepted that he's not going to say things all the time the way I would want my president to speak, polished and informed. I can accept that. He is the people's president. He was elected. They liked this about him. What I really find trouble embracing, accepting, is friends who I know better doing that, defending him, explaining, lying to my face on television or in a press conference or in an interview. That's not what he said. What? I literally just heard him say this. That's been exasperating. And personally, as a member of the media, it's been exasperating and very, very troubling to watch Trump turn on such an important institution of American democracy, the media. It is not all fake news. There isn't one media. The job we do, whether you like our political opinions or not, is vital. And so to see his cohorts also taking that up has been, and I know they know better, has been very
So what are the
hard to watch.
implications for the Republican Party and conservatism of all of this? What are the implications, long-term implications, do you see?
Well, the more conservatives defend all of this, this was my concern when he was running, that we would get sort of smeared with his patina. And that conservatism would become a movement of Trump. Now, I don't believe that. I don't believe he represents conservatism. I said many times on CNN, I thought he wore the Republican Party like a rented tuxedo to get through the election. But the more conservatives rush to his defense, and we're not all doing that, but enough, certainly on the Hill, then it's very difficult for someone like me to say, that's not who we are. Clearly it is, and I'm the outlier. And that's fine, I'm happy to be the outlier, but I'm not gonna change my principles. But the implications for the conservative movement is that the conservative movement gets a different identity by the end of this. People like me will still be kicking around, trying to, screaming that we're not all like that, and that, we once had a very sane message. But we're definitely at risk of him co-opting the movement and taking it into a different place.
Van, let me talk about the other side of the equation. I was on a panel with James Carville before the last election, and he said the thing that he appreciated about Barack Obama most is that he had driven 40% of the Republican Party stark raving mad. He just underestimated the number of people who were mad. But now there's the opposite, which is that there are a lot of progressives and a lot of Democrats who are enraged by not just some of the things that Trump has said and is proposing, and there's a lot to be provoked about in some of the steps he's taken, but also by the way Obama had been treated. And there is this sense, the Supreme Court nominee being put on the shelf and things like that. And there's this sense that turnabout is fair play. And now we're going to treat Trump exactly the way Obama was treated, or more so. What is the danger in that? Or is there a danger in that? Is that the appropriate way to respond?
I don't know. First of all, I think the threat is bigger than the threat to just the Democrats or the Republicans. I think that democracy, as we've known it, as a people, as an American people, have fought to define it and defend it, is, I think, under grave threat. And I think about that three things. One, I think Trump is much worse than even the most hysterical liberals thought he would be in September, October. I also think, though, a lot of Trump's voters are much better than people fear. You have a lot of Trump voters who weren't voting for all of this. Some of them were voting strictly on reproductive choice and being pro-life.
But well, let me just interrupt. Why do you say that? Because one of the things that I think we should give him credit for is that he's doing a lot of the things that he said he would do. I think a lot of people, we were told, don't take him, literally take him seriously. Well, we should have taken him literally. He is doing those things that he said he would do, and he is, in fact, making that a point, that he is following up on his campaign promises. And so why should people be surprised about what he's doing?
Well, I don't think that people should necessarily be surprised, though I do think it's not uncommon for people to run for office and say one thing and do something else.
But one of his virtues, as he presented it, was, I'm not one of those people.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, he's presenting a lot of his recklessness as a character plus. I was crazy when I ran, and I'm crazy now. So from his point of view, that's like, at least I'm consistently crazy, and so therefore, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that the peril is greater than we now how can the Democrats get more people elected dog catchers so that then they can eventually get the Senate back and this kind of stuff. And I just think that first of all, we have to take account of, democracies can erode. Democracies can actually disappear. It's unusual to have a democratic republic. I mean, look at 10,000 years of human history. You've only had a few, the Romans couldn't hold on to theirs. So you have democracy in decline right now. The Putin model, the China model, the ISIS model. These are the big competitors with the American model. And the American model is in real danger, in real trouble. And I think that Democrats reacting the way that we are is actually helping Trump. Because we have become so, listen, every time he does something, we start fanning ourselves and fainting. And I don't think it's very attractive. I think that people want to, he is running a pro-prosperity and pro-pride movement. That is what Trump is running for his base. Pro-prosperity and pro-pride. We are running a pro-polite movement. Like a you should say things nicer and you should respect our rules more movement. And a pro-polite versus a pro-pride movement, you can already tell who's going to win. So I think that part of what we've got to be able to do is say, listen, this guy strikes me as a nut job who's a threat to everybody. And you've got a bunch of problems that are not likely to get solved anytime soon, and I want to help you solve them. I think that we are getting pulled into a dynamic that helps him. By us being so concerned about everything that he says, it's almost like he's hypnotized a big chunk of the country to just react to him all the time. And while we're reacting to all of his outrages, there are outrages happening on the streets of America every day. There are outrages happening on reservations and in Appalachia every day. And we're not responding to those because we're so mad at him. And I am very happy to be a part of CNN. First of all, I got a chance to meet both of you guys at CNN. But also I get a chance to go around the country. I've been in West Virginia. I just came off the border yesterday, talking to people who are actually on front lines dealing with this immigration set of challenges and opportunities. And what I want to say is I think we are doing the same thing today, liberals and Democrats, that we did for 18 months during the primary. If I can just explain to more people that this guy is a jackass, eventually I will win. And I think most people already know he's a jackass. They've made a judgment about him. They have not made a judgment yet about the opposition to him. Do we actually care about real people? Do we have ideas that will matter? Can we get past our own little silos and our own little snobberies and actually reach out? And until we do that, I think this guy is happy every time he says something crazy and we go nuts. I don't really care that much at this point about the Democratic Party or about the Republican Party. I don't think ordinary people feel like they got a party. And I think until one of these parties figures that part out, I think we're going to see more of what we're seeing.
Just to pick up on Essie's point earlier, we had, and I'm sure there were people on different sides of this issue here, we had Corey Lewandowski here last week. That engendered a protest outside the meeting, also part of our democracy and important. But there's a lot of anger and a lot of rage about what this administration is doing, and the sense that don't have anybody associated with him, because then you're normalizing the administration. And I have a different view, but
Can I speak to
I'm
that?
interested in yours.
Look, I don't like bigots and bullies. I just want to point that out. I'm against bigots, I'm against bullies. So just leave that as it is.
Those who like bigots and bullies,
Yeah.
raise your...
Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to say I got tough talk for my liberal colleagues on these campuses. And they don't tend to like it, but they tend to like me, so I can get away with it. So I'm going to keep trying to push.
Let's test the proposition.
Exactly. I want to push this. There are two ideas about safe spaces. One is a very good idea, and one is a terrible idea. The idea of being physically safe on a campus, not being subjected to sexual harassment and physical abuse or something like that, or being targeted specifically personally for some kind of hate speech, you are an N-word, or whatever. Perfectly fine with that. Perfectly fine with that. But there's another view that is now, I think, ascendant, which I think is just a horrible view, which is that I need to be safe ideologically. I need to be safe emotionally. I just need to feel good all the time. And if someone says something that I don't like, that is a problem for everybody else, including the administration. And I think that is a terrible idea for the following reason. I don't want you to be safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. I'm not going to take all the weights out of the gym. That's the whole point of the gym. This is the gym. You can't live on a campus where people say stuff you don't like, and these people can't fire you. They can't arrest you. They can't beat you up. They can just say stuff you don't like, and you get to say stuff back. And this you cannot bear. This is ridiculous BS. Liberals, my parents, and Monica Elizabeth Peake's parents, hello Monica, were marched. They dealt with fire hoses. They dealt with dogs. They dealt with beatings. You can't deal with a mean tweet? You are creating a kind of liberalism that the minute it crosses the street into the real world is not just useless, but obnoxious and dangerous. I want you to be offended every single day on this campus. I want you to be deeply aggrieved and offended and upset, and then to learn how to speak back. Because that's what we need from you in these communities.
I have nothing to add.
You should see him when he gets passionate. We've got a microphone here. Please line up for questions. We're going to reserve the first three for students, please. Or one student can ask 3 questions. Please make sure they are questions. And I want to announce also that Essie's going to have to cut out a little early because she is moving tomorrow, and she left that enterprise to come here and be with us today, and we're appreciative of it. So we want her to make her flight. And with that,
Great. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Tala Mountro. I'm a student at the Booth School of Business. My question is, You're all commenters for fake news CNN. You're certainly no Fox and Friends. So my question is, how do you feel about Trump's comments on the media? And this has been touched on a little bit. And what does the mainstream media need to do to make sure that Trump supporters don't just believe the White House's alternative facts?
You know, I've written about this a lot because it obviously hits close to home. And I think the biggest burden will be on the media itself to, instead of competing for access, which is what the media has done over the past 2 years, recognize that we are a community and an institution that needs to support one another. I remember, and I'm sure Axe, you do too, and Van as well, in the early months of the Obama administration, there was word that a Treasury appointee was not going to get an interview with the Fox News pool reporter. And the other pool reporters from different outlets said, no, you want one of us, you have to take all of us. That's the way the media should respond in supporting freedom of the press and each other. And instead, we saw Donald Trump in a press conference point to Jim Acosta, our colleague at CNN, and say, no, you're fake news, you don't get to ask a question. And not one reporter in that room of probably 100 said, well, I'm going to ask his question for him, or I'm going to leave if you don't let him ask a question. Now, I don't take umbrage with that because it's CNN. I'd be just as pissed if it were Fox or someone else. But we've kind of forgotten, as press, our strength, that we need to work with each other and support each other, and that the threat is not Fox and CNN. The threat is now in the White House. And people are right when they say no one cares about the media and the media is never going to get sympathy. That's probably true. It doesn't make it any less important. And when Van talks about a democracy being undermined, it's not just maybe that Trump wants to take some of your rights away, because he does. It's that he wants to undermine the credibility of these institutions, like the press, like the watchdog of the state, like the intelligence community. These institutions that Americans should have faith in and trust in, because that's how a democracy functions. He wants you to distrust them. Why? So you trust him more. It's a consolidation of power thing, and it's what dictators do.
That's right.
Because they're insecure, and they don't want you to listen to anyone but them. So honestly, I mean, there are things consumers can do, news consumers can do, but I honestly think this is our problem. We've got to get better at our jobs. I don't think we've been as good at our jobs as we can be. And we've got to remember, who is the enemy now? It's not Fox. It's not MSNBC. The enemy is in the White House. We're going to have to deal with that.
I just, I would just take issue with one thing. I don't really think that it should even be approached in terms of who the enemy is. I think the media needs to get over this, because this is going to be a 4-year running story.
Yeah.
And it's going to get very tiresome to hear stories about how the media is being mistreated and disrespected. Reporters should just I agree with much of the rest of what you said. Reporters, I think there's been no greater time for journalism than right now. There's no greater need for journalism than right now. And reporters just have to intensely put their heads down, do their job, not get distracted by this. And I think that, in answer to your question, there are a lot of Americans who are going to take seriously what they see. So.
Well, I agree. I don't need respect. And Donald Trump does not respect me. Just look at his Twitter feed. That's fine. But what we do need is access. What we demand is the truth. And when you're being silenced and shut down, I'm not going to stop talking about that. It's not going to happen, because that's the difference between us and them. That's the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship.
Without question.
That's what we should be fighting for.
Let's get one more question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michael Rubin. I'm a student at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools, and I have a question about checks and balances. With the Republican Congress and a Supreme Court nomination in progress, as well as a full-on attack on the media by the Trump administration, how do you see the future of checks and balances proceeding in this administration?
Badly.
Now, anything to add?
I mean, this is the thing we all said, well, don't worry, because checks and balances. Don't worry, the Supreme Court, international law, Geneva Conventions, Congress. That's all true, big picture, esoterically, maybe theoretically. But you see how undermining these institutions can chip away at their power in checks and balances. Yeah. And when Republicans are controlling the full smash, you have to kind of look elsewhere for the checks and balances. Where do I look?
But let
media. We are a check and balance. That's
well,
why we have
let's
to
just
continue
point out,
this.
because we shouldn't be relentlessly downbeat here. I think this has been actually an encouraging month from the standpoint that the courts stopped a ill-conceived travel ban.
Right.
The media exposed a lie on the part of General Flynn, and he was forced to resign.
Yep.
I mean, we have seen checks and balances work. We just have to make sure that they need to be robust and they need to be continuous.
Let me say something about this. If you look at these people we call the founders, which as far as I'm concerned, the founders go from Washington through at least Dr. King. I mean, it took a very long time to found a democratic republic that included everybody. But if you look at the first founders, they were pretty clear that these paper rules were fragile. They had a term they called Republican virtue. There was no Republican Party, they weren't talking about the GOP, but that there were certain virtues, certain habits of mind, certain disciplines, certain character traits that they called Republican virtues, the virtues that would allow the republic to function. And they were very clear about that. Part of the reason that having someone like him in the presidency is so dangerous is because he shows none of those Republican virtues, none of the respect for the kinds of checks and balances. And so what you have now is a bull that is just going to run against every fence, every containment, and test it to see if, in fact, it can hold. And what I'm going to tell you is some of these institutions may not hold. I don't know if the intelligence community a year from now will be other than an extension of a propaganda machine out of the White House. That is a very dangerous thing. And so I think that we as individual people, as people who are parts of civil society, social movements, whatever, have a real responsibility to take this stuff seriously. But when I say take it seriously, I don't mean this perpetual freak out. Right now what I'm seeing is just people addicted to being outraged. And what I know is somebody who spent my entire 20s outraged. I spent my entire 30s in therapy because you can't stay outraged. It doesn't work. It's not a strategy. And so what I would encourage people to do is to join organizations, get involved in stuff. Don't just look at TV and repost and retweet, because it's amazing. What I think happens is exactly what you said. A big orange asteroid has hit the Earth, and it knocked open the Fort Knox of how do I get involved and what can I do? Mm-hmm. There's way more there. The problem is not just that you got mean people doing mean things. The problem is that you have amazing good people in both parties and no party who just don't know what to do yet. And so your great hope is that there is still Republican virtue, there still is a pro-democracy sentiment, and it's still here in the country. It just hasn't been tapped and organized. And so that is hard work, but it's work I think is work we should be taking on.
I need to excuse S.C. Cupp here.
Thank you for
Give her a
having
big
me, guys.
hand.
I appreciate it.
I just want to comment on your point. I have not seen this level of civic engagement, activism, and awareness in a very long time. And I think that the level of energy now is much higher than it was, for example, before the election. That portends something. Yes.
Hi, my name is Yang. I'm very concerned about the failure of the narrative that focus on inclusiveness, but rather on the division. The past election embodies this failure. I will illustrate in 2 points. The first is trade. People talk a lot about the zero sum of the trade, global trade, but Jack Ma, the chairman of Alibaba in Davos, talked about the future of trade should be more inclusive, the so-called inclusive globalism. But in the past election, Clinton was so defensive of the global trade, and he never provided a coherent vision in the positive light. And also in terms of identity politics, people say it's very legitimate to play identity politics, but now the identity politics turn out to be very divisional, very Manichaean, and usually it degenerates into putting your people you don't like into the box of untouchable. So my question is, how could this narrative of inclusiveness prevail in this time and age?
Wow, applause for a question. That's good.
I think inclusion is hard. I'm lucky I spent a bunch of my young adulthood in the Bay Area where you have so many different kinds of people. And I think it's very, very hard. And I think that we tend to forget that for about 10,000 years, it was totally normal and acceptable to chop someone up into small pieces because they were from a different tribe. What we are expecting and demanding of humanity, of our country, of our neighbors, is very difficult. And I think we should be less arrogant about it. Our insistence on inclusion, as progressives I'm speaking, we can't back away from. But I think there's a way of being that can be very off-putting for people and very superior for people and lacking in real empathy. I don't think that the Democratic Party in the last election was too multicultural, or too inclusive. I think we weren't inclusive enough. I don't think we drew our circle of love and concern big enough, and that let Trump take advantage. But this thing that you're pointing to in terms of how do you defend a global economy that is good for people on the planet? How do you not retreat into economic nationalisms and autarky and all that kind of stuff? That is going to be your generation's big challenge. That's not going to be resolved by a speech from some politician someplace. That is a big, big problem. How we're all going to get along. If you are a part of one of the oppressed groups, female, of color, whatever, go through the whole list, you're in this horrible catch-22, which is that if you want everybody to get along and be equal, you've got to do some work of speaking up for yourself. If you speak up for yourself, you might seem like you're being quote-unquote divisive. If you don't speak up for yourself, you're going to get run over. And so it's just this horrible catch-22. I think one thing that we're not doing a good job of on the campuses, we tend to say to the white guys, we want you guys to be more sensitive so that other people will feel better, or at least not feel bad. I don't think that's a compelling argument. And I think you can see it's not working. I think there's a different way to talk about this, which is that there is a particular skill set that we're all going to need in dealing with difference. It's a skill set in terms of being able to listen differently, being able to assume you have a blind spot or may have a blind spot, as opposed to assuming that you already know and somebody else is up to no good. That there's a leadership skill set that we want every student to have so they can go out and be more successful, build teams at work, win whatever game they're trying to play. I think that approach, and we don't need you to be sensitive to make somebody else feel better. We want you to be more skilled so you can make your own life better. That approach, I think, has to be added so that this doesn't seem just like some basically one up, one down competition, but actually seems like we're trying to make everybody a better version of themselves.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that. These forces that we talked about earlier, these forces that are driven by technology, they're impacting on everyone.
Yep.
And Andrew Young famously said once that we may have come over in different boats, in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now.
Yeah.
That's never been more true.
Yeah.
And I think there has to be some recognition that whatever our individual concerns are or our group concerns, there's this big issue that if we don't resolve is going to be catastrophic for large numbers of people. So, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Paul Hanover. I've been a resident of Chicago for quite a while. I wanted to ask you, Van, about this whole issue of automation and kind of taking it from where we were talking about, where you were just talking about 10,000 years ago, just slicing up somebody of a different tribe was no problem. Obviously, certainly in the past, there was scarcity, and we talked about, she talked about it in terms of they thought that people would run out of food because we wouldn't be able to produce it. And now through technology we have.
Okay.
Right. So is it that really we have to become like to a whole other mindset about where this automation is going to take us? You talked about the X-Men being a bunch of geeks who got together and did really cool stuff with the technology.
No, that's what Van talked about.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. and so, do you see that as some kind of an outcome that we have to get to, sort of beyond this current political?
And will we have to wear tights?
Yeah, I hope so. Look, there are all kind of scenarios out there. I would encourage everybody who's concerned about society to take the future a lot more seriously. I talk to a lot of young people in Black Lives Matter, and they're great because they care an awful lot about African American history, and they know all of our heroes and our struggles, et cetera, and they kind of see themselves as carrying out, as I did, carrying out this sort of historic struggle for justice. At this point, though, I would turn in probably 5 Black History Months for 1 Black Future weekend, right? I don't think that we spend enough time thinking about which of the various scenarios that are out here we want for ourselves. The future's worth fighting for, but you have to define it. We don't do scenario planning on the left. Corporations do. Okay, well, what if the price of oil goes here? What if this happens in this country? And they think about all different scenarios and they try to plan accordingly. We don't do that as progressives. And so what I would say is that there are great scenarios out there where technology actually makes it possible for everybody to have a lot more leisure and a lot more self-expression. And there's scenarios out there that look like the Terminator. And we're not talking about that enough because we're freaking out over every tweet from this madman. And because, frankly, we spend a lot more time trying to feel self-righteous as liberals. At least we're not those dumb conservatives. And, I'm very, very tough right now on progressive culture. I think that as a red state Christian kid, I think that progressives are way off. I hear still those dumb Trump supporters, those stupid red state voters who vote against their own self-interest. If they would just listen to NPR like us, everything would be great. And there's a colonial mentality there that almost acts as if everyone were a liberal, it would be great. We just have to do something about these dumb conservatives. And I'm not trying to monocrop the American political spectrum. We need conservatives, and we need liberals. I want liberals to be in government, and I want the conservatives to be in opposition. But I don't want the conservatives to be in oblivion, because we need the challenge, those questions. And so I say this to you, we can't even get to this question around artificial intelligence, automation. Because by the way, it's not just the drivers they're going to get replaced. It's
No,
the
but
writers.
it's all the way up the line, yeah.
If you're a writer, they now have artificial intelligence programs that write better than you. So it's all the way. So we can't even get to that because of this train crash, but liberals won't take responsibility for part of the train crash. And what I want to say is simply this. When you hear somebody saying, oh, I don't like black people, or something like that, you should challenge it. It's bigotry. But when you hear somebody say, all Republicans are stupid, and these idiotic red state people, that's its own form of bigotry. And I just have to say this because the one thing that bothers me the most is when people say these stupid ass white males who vote against their own economic self-interest. Do you know the white people who vote against their economic self-interest? Rich white liberals who vote for tax increases to fund programs their kids never go to, okay? Now, they don't think that makes them stupid. They think it makes them awesome, right? That's the best thing about them. I'm more than just my money. My values matter. I'm willing to take a hit economically for my values. Well, surprise, that poor white guy who says, I don't want the government to go rob some rich family and take their money and bring it over to my house and bribe me to be dependent on somebody else. I don't want that. If my kids are so stupid that they won't stay off drugs or they're going to go get pregnant or be ne'er-do-wells, I don't want the government to come and bail them out and undermine my parenting. My values say that their independence is more important than that government program. See? Now, that is a terrible strategy for dealing with China. But it's noble. There's something there that's at least worth honoring before we get into the fight. And as long as we are going to be in this progressive culture where putting down other people is a big part of our identity, we're never going to be able to build the bridges to solve these problems, whether it's automation or anything else.
Thank you.
Well, why don't we take this last question, because this looks like a student question, and then we've got to call this to an end.
And Monica, will you just come down here to this front seat so we can, yeah, all right, go ahead.
Mr. Jones.
By the way, before, part of the reason I'm sitting up here is because when I was in high school and college, one of my closest friends was not like me. She was serious, she was studious, she had big ambitions for herself. She wanted to get out of Tennessee, she wanted to be a doctor, she wanted to do a bunch of great stuff.
And is she here today?
I'm getting there. And she rubbed off on me and a whole bunch of other people. And as a result of her determination to get to the best medical school in the country, I wound up going to the best law school in the country. And her name is Monica Peak, and she's here. If you just give a round of applause to Monica Peak.
A lot of people here would be surprised to know that you went to the University of Chicago Law School. I think anyway, go ahead.
Mr. Jones, I'm a first year at the law school here. A few months ago, I heard your interview on the Axe Files, and you talked about when you were at Yale, you were like at the table, and then they used the word egalitarian, and you didn't quite know what it meant. And that story really kind of left an impression on me as someone who grew up in difficult economic conditions and went to a small liberal arts college before coming here. I know a lot of friends of mine that were very, very capable in undergrad and even before that could go to really great institutions, but they don't even try to apply because they think it's like this really elite place and you need to have a good pedigree to get in. What can we do as students of a university and as a society to kind of break down some of these borders and say that no, the best universities and the best law schools are kind of open to anybody and not just those who were really born in a good condition?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question. What I can say is this. We're wasting a ton of genius in this country. Just wasting a ton of genius. I get a chance to spend time in San Quentin, which is a prison in California. The smartest people there are as smart as the smartest people anywhere, including this campus, the White House, or anything else. The smartest people there are just, but the wisest people there are wiser than any of the people I know at any of these big institutions, because they've gone through stuff and they've had to look in their own hearts and they've had to figure out things about their own psychology and human nature. You go across this country, you go to any barber shop, any nail salon, any bowling alley, and you talk to people. People are extraordinary, just extraordinary. Genius is completely well distributed. Opportunity is not. Opportunity is not. When you know that, you fight for people to have it shot. If you buy into the bullshit that some of us are smart and the rest of us, they just didn't win the smart guy lottery, smart woman lottery, and you start stewing in this elitism, and you start thinking that the number of syllables that can come out of your mouth in a sentence is the best indicator of how smart you are, as opposed to, can you say it quick and move on? You become a part of a certain problem. And this problem is going to cost the West, possibly, its democracy. Because you're now seeing this incredible division opening up throughout the West in this winner-take-all economy, where the winners really think they deserve to be the winners. They have no sense of noblesse oblige. They have no sense that they actually benefited from somebody. They should pay back in. They should help out. We're the smart ones. We're the winners. And I'm going to tell you, for the people who are left out, they are coming. They are coming. You look at the Tea Party, you look at Black Lives Matter, you look at the Dreamers, you look at Occupy, you look at Sanders, you look at Trump, more are coming. Because it's just not fair. It's just not right. And people aren't going to put up with it. And so my great hope for students like yourself and students like myself and students like Monica, who come out of the more humble parts of this country, is that we will realize their stuff, it is true that these kids who went to these fancier schools know that we don't know when we get here. But as I told David, you can learn that stuff in a book. The stuff you know, because of where you came from, nobody can learn in a book. And so you have so much more value, and your contributions are so much more important. I'm glad that you're here. We need more students like you here.
Well, let me say in closing to Monica, if you had some responsibility for raising this man,
Yes.
Good job. Good job. Man, thank you very much.
Good.